Great. Hi, Kimoon.
Hi, Eunice.
Okay, so thank you so much for joining us today. Maybe before the main session starts, you can just tell us a bit about who you are, what you do. I know you're going to mention this later on, but just to have a conversation going on. So, yeah.
Cool. So my name is Kimoon. I'm a Google Cloud GDE for Sub-Saharan Africa, and I'm a software and data engineer. I work at Terraflow, where we build models and deploy models at scale. And I'm very passionate about machine learning. That's why I want to talk to people here about machine learning and how we can use it and use the new tools from Google to improve people's lives. Yeah, that's a bit about me. I have been working in the industry, deploying models, creating models since 2014. And yeah, ever since Google released their first ML sort of API, the Vision API, I've been very fascinated and started getting into building models, deploying models, and also at the same time learning about how Google builds its machine learning models. And not only that, also very fascinated about the workflow mechanism that Google has now produced, specifically TensorFlow Extended or TFX, which is a workflow pipeline that essentially manages your end-to-end production lifecycle of your models. So we're going to briefly touch that on the call itself, or the slides or the sessions.
Okay, so Kimoon, if somebody was to ask you, like, why cloud? What really motivated you to just focus on cloud and make it your thing?
Cool. So when people say why cloud, I don't. It's not a matter of because it's infinitely scalable or it has better resources and stuff. The reason why people move to the cloud is because they want to leverage the products and services that cloud has to offer. So people think cloud is just a storage mechanism whereby you store something and then maybe someone would think cloud is a place where there's servers and you can connect to it using an internet connection. But cloud is more than that. It's more about how you can build applications in harmony, meaning you build one component and then you think, and later down the line, it's you need additional API services, and cloud offers that. So essentially, you can plug and play as if you have a computer, which can be seen as your application, and suddenly you need more storage device, so you can plug in a hard drive or plug in a USB, and cloud enables you to do that. It enables you to plug and play services that different cloud vendor has to offer. So yeah, I'm team cloud, and yeah, encourage people when building their application to think about that terminology where cloud is just not about servers and storage mechanism. Think about it as products and services that is managed by a cloud provider, and you have the keys to a car and you consume it as you require.
Okay, interesting. So you have mentioned the GDE program. I know we're not going to get into that today, but what are some of the things that one needs to like have in order to be a developer expert in cloud or any other field that they may be interested in?
Cool. So one of the things that you need to sort of everyone needs to forget about this one component, and that's promoting text. So, for example, on Google Cloud, you need to have expertise on the Google Cloud system. So, and people come to me and say, but do we need to know all the stacks? Because it ranges from App Engine to ML Engine, AI platform, and there's lots of products, and you cannot be an expert in all the products. But having technical experience in building an application, such as using App Engine to build your website and connecting it to a machine learning API on ML Engine, or using Firestore or Datastore as a database mechanism. If you have experience and you're able to create that architecture and you are very comfortable with it, that would be one of the tick boxes for the technical requirements. The one thing that people seems to miss is the community aspect, and that is trying to get involved in doing talks, presentations, and promoting Google Cloud or your personal project, saying, hey, I built this on Google Cloud and I want to contribute to the community, meaning I built this really awesome product that detects earthquakes, and I'm sharing it with people, and I'm writing articles. And then I'm going to, and as well, I'm speaking at GDG events. And once you get that ball rolling, and I would advise people to have links and references to those events and the talks that you have done. And then once you have the community aspect ticked, the technical aspect ticked, then you can approach someone like myself or a Google person and say, no, they want to become a GDE, and then we'll get that process started. So depending on what you call it, whether you get someone who interviews you quickly, or because someone is busy, for example, a Googler or a community interviewer, it might take longer. So I would say as long as you tick those aspects, anyone can become a GDE.
Okay, so thank you so much, Kimoon. I am just going to remove you from stage to do the introduction, then have you back.
Cool.
Okay. So hello, everyone, and thank you for joining us for today's final Next on Air extended series by the SSA Google Developer Experts. So for today's session, we are joined by two amazing GDEs, Robert John, who happens to be a machine learning Google developer expert, and Kimoon Kim, who happens to be a Google developer expert for cloud. So they're going to tell us more about who they are, what they do, before they take a deep dive into Google Cloud AI. But just so you know, in case you have questions, feel free to drop it on the chat section, and then we will be able to highlight it so that the speakers can answer it once they're done speaking. So let me, okay, great. Hi and bye.
Hi, everyone. Hi, Robert.
Hi, Kimoon.
Cool. Yeah, so a little bit of introduction about myself and Robert, and I'll go first. For those who saw me a bit earlier, I think it will be a bit of a recap. So I'm a Google Cloud GDE for Sub-Saharan Africa. I'm passionate about machine learning. And yeah, today we are going to be talking about cool things that Google has released in terms of the AI, and as well what you call talk about certain topics that Google is focusing towards business transformation. Myself, I'm a co-founder of a company called TerraFlow. We do AI build models, and we just want to make AI work. So yeah, that's a brief introduction from my side. Maybe Robert?
Hi, everyone. So my name is Robert, based out of Nigeria, and I am a Google developer expert for machine learning as well as for the Google Cloud platform. So I spend my time during the day working on the Google Cloud platform, typically around the data section, and that's dealing with databases or with other tools that help with data transformation or data processing, or even with data visualization. And outside of work, I do a bit of public speaking, a bit of writing, a bit of mentoring. So that's really it about me. Back to you, Kimoon, or to Eunice.
Cool. So maybe I can get the talk in session. Oh, sorry, Eunice, maybe a bit about yourself.
Okay, so hi everyone. My name is Alela Eunice. Most know me as Denise. I am a community manager for the Google Developer Experts program for Sub-Saharan Africa. So we have been running this Next on Air series for the past, I think, 6 weeks now, and we have seen amazing GDEs just talk to us about the various things that were talked about during Next on Air. And so today happens to be the final. Yeah, you know, when I say final, I'm like, it's the last one. So it happens to be the final episode of our 4-part series that we're going to be having. And I'm sure we are going to learn a lot from both Kimoon and Robert. So in case you have any questions, like I say, just drop it on the chat section. I'll be able to push them forward to them to answer. So yeah, I am going to go off stage and just be a fly on the wall.
Thanks, Eunice. If we can go to the next slide, I just want to give a bit of recap on what happened in Google Cloud AI that was released on Google Next. So it was a session that was hosted on the first week of September. So many things have happened. And if you have missed some of these components, they are available for you to consume at the Google's website on YouTube. So you can stay up to date with all the contents that was released. And Google also writes blog posts about it, summarizes it, so please go have a look. So just a brief general introduction. We're going to be looking at how businesses generate value with AI and how customers are using AI in their business. And this is particularly important because from a McKinsey report, it says that companies will fully absorb AI in their workflow by 2025, will dominate the 2030 world economy with 120% cash flow growth. What this means is that lots of companies are going to be using AI as time goes by. So we'll be touching on a bit about that. And then we'll be talking a brief introduction on how customers like Verizon and Etsy use Google Cloud's tools to implement AI to increase their productivity and scalability. Another big announcement was Google's approach to building AI, so the principles and values. And this is something that I want to go into a bit of more detail because I don't know if Robert, you can agree with me, when you're building models or machine learning models, the last thing on your mind is whether you're building it for the good or building it for the evil, and whether or not you have missed something. And then thereafter, I'll talk more about the contact center AI and document AI that Google is trying to get businesses to use to streamline your business, to make it easier and faster. And we'll go through the demo if time allows us to do that. And then we'll touch a bit about MLOps because it's the next big thing in Google Cloud AI. And this session will be interactive. So Robert and I will be having conversations and talking about various topics as I have laid out. And yeah, as Eunice has said, please use the Cloud Q&A, the bit.ly link to ask questions so that we have time for that at the end to go through them. Cool. Maybe Robert, if there's anything that I've missed, maybe if you can just add in a bit of more context as well.
Okay, great. Thanks, Kimoon. So I think before we go into what's new in Google Cloud AI, it might be helpful to talk about what exactly Google Cloud AI is. particularly because there is AI on the one hand, and then there's Google Cloud AI. So I'll just quickly state that AI, as we all know it, is the quest to get computers to attain human level intelligence. But that requires a lot of knowledge with mathematics, with computer science, with software engineering. The challenge with all of that is, if you take an analogy, right? Do you need to be an aeronautic engineer before you can take yourself from Lagos to Johannesburg? No, you don't, right? Most people who fly aren't aeronautic engineers. They don't know anything about planes, right? Even the pilots don't need to be aeronautic engineers. They just need to know how to read the instruments, and operate the plane. So what Google Cloud AI is it's a platform from Google that lets you make use of AI products, right? But you're not going into the nitty-gritty details of what's the math, what's the statistics, what's the computer science behind all of this. And as you're going to be seeing later during the program, Kimoon is going to be talking about contact center AI, for example, as one thing. And what that does is it lets companies that have to deal with a lot of customer requests automate and extract insights from their processes without going into the nitty-gritty details of things like natural language understanding or language translation or sentiment analysis from these things. So I just wanted to lay that foundation for what Google Cloud AI is, and then we'll go into what's new. And the reason why it's called what's new is that Google Cloud AI itself isn't new, although it might be the first time that you're hearing about it, but it's been there for over a year. So I think as of last year, it was called Cloud AI. But prior to that time, it was called Machine Learning Platform on the GCP. So it was a really small component. It was typically just one place where you went to deploy your models, and it would help you auto scale and create API endpoints that you could call. But now it's really grown, and so now it's called Cloud AI Platform, and it has a bunch of things in it. So back to you, Kimoon.
Cool. Robert, you brought back a lot of memories back there. So when I first started with machine learning, it was a simple virtual machine with Jupyter Notebook on it. And then Google released something called Data Lab, where essentially you can spin up a Jupyter Notebook on a virtual machine and access it using open ports 8080, for example. And then that has transformed from Data Lab into, I think it was moved on to something called AI Notebook. I might be mistaken, but essentially what you are able to do now is spin up a Jupyter Notebook style platform on a virtual machine, and you can interact with lots of data sets from Kaggle, from BigQuery, etc. And now we're entering another stage of Google Cloud AI, is that we are moving towards more of an ML journey. And I'll talk about more about the MLOps journey towards the end, but essentially it allows you to build models from conceptual stage all the way to production using a pipeline or a workflow engine. And most of the time people like using Kubeflow or mini cubes, etc. But yeah, we'll jump into that later. And I think that would be the next evolution of the Google Cloud AI. Cool. So if we jump on to the next slide, what I want to talk about is responsible AI is successful AI. But I want to propose this question to everyone is, does a successful AI means you are building a responsible AI? And I'm going to let you think about this, because let me give you an example. So if I successfully created an AI model that's hiring employees based on 10 years worth of data, the model will be successful. It will work. But unbeknown to me, there might be biases because the data might just contain male applicants. And then the algorithms will be trained on male applicants. And then when female applicant starts applying, there will be biases towards male applicants. So these are one of the examples that not all successful AIs would be a responsible AI. And we need to ensure that there's some sort of framework or data governance in place in order for us to sort of build AI responsibly. And we know AI could be very, very powerful. We see it in YouTube, we see it in Google search, and it even helps millions of people's lives by telling us where the best place to plant our crops using satellite images. So this brings us to a point where we know by 2030, AI will be the #1 driver of GDP growth. But as we said, not all AI is responsible, meaning one needs to realize that we need to make sure that this does not happen. Robert, I just want to ask you a question. Have you ever built a model where you encountered these biases, and were you able to see them when building them?
So that's an interesting question. Typically, no, you can't see the biases when you're building. And it's one of those things that is called an unknown. So you have your known unknowns, which is I am aware that something doesn't factor into this model. And the reason might be that I simply do not have that data. But an unknown is that you don't even know that that thing exists. And as a result, it's not a component of your model. And the disaster is simply waiting to happen further down the road, because when you do encounter that scenario that you weren't aware existed, the model simply breaks down. And a simple example of that would be, say, sometimes when you have some AI built into a camera that lets you smile, and then it knows that you're ready to take a picture, right? Now, if that model is built on, say, Caucasian data, it's going to work quite well during, model training, model evaluation on the Caucasian side. Now, it's just possible that the people training that model don't even know that out there in the wild that there are other people who aren't Caucasian. And so they're not aware that there's a bias, right? They might just hear at some point in time that, hey, when this camera got to Asia, it stopped working. Or when this camera got to sub-Saharan Africa, it stopped working. Now, why isn't it working becomes, the question. And they can't immediately say, oh, well, that's because of skin tones, right? So typically for me, if there's bias, I'm not going to be aware of it at the beginning. I might be aware of it further down the road when the model is in production.
Yeah, and that's quite important, because in my next slide, it answers the specific questions that people might have is, how can I begin to understand and apply these opposite ethical frameworks in my organization? So, for instance, in my case, I built models for enterprises and corporates. And from my side, I'm just given a task to say, hey, build this model that's able to increase my sales by however many percentage. And not knowingly, they give me the data, and that data is only bias. I mean, the only factor that influences the data is the framework that is imposed on that data. So what this means is, for example, in South Africa, we have something called the POPI Act, which is protection of personal information. And that means that I cannot, store data or use data that will link to an individual. But these frameworks don't dictate those biases, Robert, that you were speaking about, maybe the skin tone, or maybe the example I gave, the female applicants versus male applicants. If there's more biases towards male applicants, obviously the algorithm will favor the male applicants. So we need to be cognizant of that, and we need to. That's why I want to sort of raise people's awareness, is because. For instance, in the medical industry, we have committees, the ethics committee that stops people from testing drugs or harmful drugs on humans before rolling it out, right? We have these protection mechanisms in place. And we know that AI is very powerful and it can change people's lives, but there's very vague sort of protections that's out there for people to use. So that's where I want to sort of highlight where Google actually brought out the principles and values. And this is something that was released on the Google Next for Google Cloud AI. And I think people should stress and use it in order to build their models effectively. So if we look at the next slide, these are sort of the principles and values that Google has laid out. And this is accessible on the Google homepage. So just type in AI principles and values, and it will give you a list of what AI should be and should not be. So for example, an AI should be socially beneficial, which means it must account a broad range of social and economic factors and benefit society as a whole, which respects culture, social and legal norms. It must avoid creating or reinforcing unfair bias. It must be built for safety and tested at the same time. And one important thing to note is that it also must be accountable for people. So what this means is that the algorithm shouldn't dictate what the AI should be. It must be, a human must dictate what the algorithm should do, for example. So these are all the things that AI should be. And what AI should not be is something that would likely to cause harm or direct injury or surveillance or violating internationally accepted norms. So you shouldn't collect data that you didn't consent for. And it also mustn't break international laws and human rights. And Google has given this framework for us to use. And I think this is quite powerful because now it allows us to use these principles and values and take them and build our models, as opposed to building our models and thinking about them later. Robert, maybe, I don't know, what do you think about this topic, and what's your views on it?
Yeah, absolutely. So typically as an African, we do not pay a lot of attention to consent. Unfortunately, because of the history, our very young democracies and the kinds of violence that we've experienced as Africans, we do not ask for people's permission when we do things, right? And you see that with even in governance, changes in taxation rates, for instance, without public feedback or opinion. So we also tend to carry that into business. And in business, for instance, you might find yourself building a loan default prediction model using data, right? Now, typically, as the machine learning engineer or as the data scientist, you're given data to work with. It's usually not the first thought that you ask, hey, how did you get this data, right? But that's where principles and values will come in. Of course, the difficult part is that being Africans, given the shortage of jobs and things like that, you're usually not able to say, hey, I'm not going to work with this data if I'm not sure that it's ethically sourced, right? Because you could be putting your job on the line. So people might say it's a whole lot easier if you're American or European, where you can say, hey, I'm not going to work with this data because it's not ethically sourced. And if you fire me, I'll simply get another job tomorrow. Maybe there are 10 companies waiting to hire me, right? But we need to ask those questions. And the reason being that if the data isn't ethically sourced, there's also the probability that the data isn't accurate. So while you're busy building a model and you're thinking, oh, based off of the data that I have, I'm going to roll out a model that has got some high precision or some high recall, and it's going to meet some evaluation metrics that have been set by the company, and we'll be able to roll this into production. Don't forget that there's also something called training serving skew, which is to say there's training data that you collected last year and you built a model and you put it in production, it works for a month, and then it suddenly stops working. Now, why has it stopped working? It stopped working because the data that you're dealing with in inference or in production kind of has different statistical measures from the data that you worked with. So the measures of central tendency and deviation are just completely different, because in production the kind of people that you're evaluating, so let's take the loan default model, the kind of people that you're evaluating in production just happen to be completely different from the kind of people whose data you were using to train the model, right? Now, if this were ethically sourced, you might even know, for instance, that, hey, this thing isn't going to work because you're getting data from the wrong set of people, right? So while as Africans, we might have that cognitive dissonance of saying, why do we need to ask for people's permission before we use the data? Or does it even make sense to ask those questions? In reality, it will save you a whole lot of stress if you do that.
Yeah, thanks, Robert. Yeah, I completely agree with you. As Africans, AI is one of the fields that places all the other countries on a similar playing field. So as Africans, I see a lot of talents of developers, machine learning experts, and they are able to build incredible models as well using data that's African data, meaning it's specifically for African use cases. One of the examples that I'd like to bring is, for example, the USSD data that most African people are familiar with, is that they instead of text messaging having unstructured data, the USSD data is structured such that you know what each of the phone number that you press into the phone links to what action that was done. And there are lots of data like that you can use to sort of build models upon. But in my case, build models where it's mostly used to increase profits. And that's where I think we need to sort of think about, hey, when we're building this model, is it going to be social beneficial? Is it going to create biases? Or is it going to be tested for safety? I think these are the sort of questions, the principles and values that one should be thinking about. And it's not as simple as saying, oh, I built a model and it does this, it works, and then you move on. And yeah, another thing that I would like to highlight is that AI should uphold high standards of scientific excellence. And this means that AI is sort of, because we have the compute power to create models very quickly, I remember creating a model that differentiates between a cat and a dog 5 years ago. And on my personal computer, it took 2 weeks to even train a model that was maybe 82 or 83% accurate. But now you can train those models very quickly, maybe 5 minutes, 7 minutes, using cloud computing. So these unlocks potential future research, and we must aspire to the same level of innovation as what we have for the medical field, as well as, let's say, the financial field. AI should also be taken with the high standards of scientific excellence. Cool. So that was just a brief touch on principles and values. I would like to also say to you guys, if you would like to learn more about these topics, you can go to the website on YouTube and start looking at AI principles and values. So another new technology that Google has released is something called well, it's not released, it's an additional feature, but it's a rapid response virtual agent on contact center AI. So what is contact center AI? It's exactly what its name says. So it's essentially what you have is people calling into, let's, for example, you got the wrong order from a product company. So I got the wrong shoes and I'm phoning in to say, hey, I got the wrong shoe. So instead of that interaction with human, you're going to have an interaction with AI, and the AI will solve that issue. And I'm going to give you a brief demo and also talk about its pros and cons and how we can sort of change that sort of thinking. So for those who are interested, there's a bit.ly link that you can go to, which will direct you to the same demo that I'm going to be showing.
Kimoon, I'll stop sharing so that you can take over for the demo.
Cool. Can you guys see my screen?
Not
yet. Did you hit share screen already?
Yes, I'm just changing my security settings. Sorry, 2 minutes, please. I seem to have some difficulties with my screen sharing.
Do you want me to share my screen instead?
Yes, please. I think that would be...
Okay, let me open the link.
There. Can you guys see my screen?
Not yet.
Okay, yeah.
Cool. So if you follow through that website, it will showcase you the contact center AI demo. And this will teach you guys more about what a virtual agent is. So I'm not going to be using my microphone, which I can, but instead of using my microphone, I'm going to type using my keyboard. So for example, I can say hello. And then the contact center AI will reply with, hey, I'm Joe, a virtual demo agent. I can answer questions about the contact center AI. Would I like to know what it is? And I say, yes, please. And then it will reply to me saying, okay, great. CC AI is a conversational AI built specifically for contact centers. It's pretty cool. It automates simple interactions and makes human agents more effective. And can I tell you how it works? And I click yes. And then it replies to me. It essentially takes me to more about how contact center AI work. And it also gives me an ability to see what impact will I see with my companies. And that is, let's say, for example, I have, let's say, how many agents do I have? Let's say I have, maybe I have 5 agents working at my company that takes calls. And how many calls do I get a month? Let's say I get between 5 agents, 10 calls. Let's say I get 150 calls a month. And let's say my cost per call in US dollars is, let's say, $2.5. Now it will calculate for me that I am able to save around $900 and decrease my handle time by 10% just by using contact center AI. Now, this is a cool tool that Google has released, and what you call it, it's one of those tools that Verizon has used to improve its handling time with customers, routing to the correct agent, and solving problems that doesn't need to be routed to a human. But it poses this one question: will there be job losses? And to tell you the truth, there is, but it's not all gloom and doom, meaning those people can now be repurposed to what you call it, do some other jobs, such as solving particular problems that AI would not be able to solve. So for example, if a caller requires more human interaction level to solve their problems, an AI will never understand the human emotional context. And that's where the repurposing comes in. So jobs from a call center perspective will be lost, but those lost jobs will be replaced with people with more human capabilities. Maybe, John, if you have more feedback on this and how you see it working around enterprises and corporates.
Yeah. So I have some experience with telecoms. I did work in telecoms, and I also have experience building and scaling out some pretty large contact centers at a national scale on 2 occasions for our national elections. Now, the thing that people tend to, I think, ask wrongly about contact centers is the question of, will there be job losses? So the contact center is not kind of like a bank where people go to work for 7 years or 10 years and they're happy. It's a very strenuous job. If what you're doing is talking on the phone, imagine sitting for 5 hours and just talking. It's pretty difficult, right? Like even teachers don't talk for 5 hours. They rarely do, right? There's usually 1 hour, 2 hours for a lecture, and then they have a break and things like that. So contact centers are pretty strenuous as a job, and as a result, people usually have to work shifts. But there's a lot of turnover in the contact center industry. So usually companies have to employ some sort of redundancy in the event that people do not turn up for work. A lot of the time, contact centers need to run 7 days a week because nothing stops. So case in point is, let's take a bank as an example, right? If you have a payment failure on a Saturday, why do you have to wait until Monday to file a complaint, right? So the contact center needs to work. While the bank itself is shut, the contact center needs to be operational. But contact center agents can't work 7 days a week. It's absolutely impossible. So they tend to run shifts. Sometimes they work 3 days on, 2 days off, and then they randomize it, but they also need to go on leave. So if you look at the human capital requirements for contact centers, it's massive, it's huge. But that's on the one hand, that's assuming that the company has got sufficient capacity for its agents. A lot of the time, that isn't the case. And how you know that is when you do get in touch with a contact center, you're usually put on a queue. How long do you have to wait? This past week, I had to call my bank's contact center on more than two occasions. And I was put on the queue for 17 minutes. I checked the last time I called. I was put on the queue for 17 minutes before I was able to speak with an agent. Now that's the speaking side. They implemented a WhatsApp channel for communicating with agents. And the last time that I used it, it took me an hour before I could communicate with an agent. So I logged onto the chat and I had to wait for an hour before someone could attend to me. And then afterwards, we were chatting for over an hour and my problems had not been solved, right? So if you look at it from this perspective, the question really isn't about will people lose jobs? The question is about capacity. How do you rapidly scale capacity, right? So your customers are really what's important to you. Do you want to keep me waiting on the line for 17 minutes before I get to speak with you? Because while I'm doing that, I can't do anything else, right? I can't dial in and then start driving somewhere or dialing and start writing code and doing stuff. I have to wait for for an agent to attend to me. So the way to look at contact center AI is to say, how do we rapidly scale up capacity to the point where the things that could be quickly handled in an automated fashion are handled in an automated fashion. And then we're able to escalate to human agents when that human touch is required, right? So that way you have a whole lot more people being attended to, a whole lot more people being happy, and you still maintain the jobs. It's just that now you don't have to scale up on the jobs. And maybe because there's less stress on the human agents, you don't have as much of a turnover as you typically would.
That's a great response, John. What you call it. This ties closely with our next topic, which is document AI. And document AI is also solving a fundamental issues. I've seen companies where they have millions of documents and they hire 2 to 3 people to input PDFs into their into a Word document, or typing a handwritten document into their computer, and this takes time. And this means it causes a lot of lags in terms of getting your bank loan processed or getting some form of contract approves. In one case, as John mentioned, do I want to wait 2 weeks in order for my cell phone contract to be approved? And that's where document AI comes in. And I can show you a very brief introduction of what it's capable of. And what it essentially is it's an API by Google that essentially you can put in your document, where I'm going to try Google sample. And essentially it does an OCR, object character recognition, for instance, of an invoice, and it picks up all these schemas and the values associated with the invoice itself. So for example, it picks up the unit price, it picks up the line item, the due date. And this is very powerful because now you don't need someone to input these informations, which can be prone to errors. But now you have a technology tool that's able to put out key information that is required. Picks up the tables, picks up the text, and as well, it also gives you all the response in a JSON format. So it's easy for programmers to put it into a list and sort of access the data itself. So this is one of the sort of tools that Google has released, saying, hey, guys, use it. It's very powerful. And Google is moving AI towards something that people can solve real life problems with. Robert, how difficult is it to train a neural net to recognize OCR for this purpose? Like, would you want to create your own, or would you want to use Google's tool?
Okay, so this is one of those trick questions because when you ask the question, it sounds like there's one model that is going to do it. But the funny thing about this sort of thing is that you usually need to have a bunch of models. So if you were doing it yourself, you would need a model that does, the image recognition itself. So you'd have to capture. You'd need a model that recognizes different zones in the document. And so this is assuming that you're dealing with one standard document, right? And of course, that's the easy example. So let's say you're dealing with one standard document. You need to identify zones. So for the sake of simplicity, let's take one bank that issues only one type of checkbook. And what you want to do is automate reading the check leaves as they come in. So what it means is you need something that says, this is the region where the date is, this is the region where the payee information is, this is the region where the amount in words is, this is the region where the signature is. So you need to read that. Now, how do you know that the signature is valid? What it means is you need to extract the signature from that document, and then you need to compare it with the signature that you have on file, right? So that's a separate model. It's not the same model. Now, how do you know how much that person wants to pay? Then you need to extract that region that has the amount in digits, and then you need to pass it to a model that then tries to do, that recognition to say how many digits are there. Is this a 1 or a 7 or a 9? Because we all write in funny ways. So to answer the question simply, do I want to solve this problem? Probably only if I'm going to be making enough money to buy a house in Hollywood, right? So, but beyond that, of course, if there's something that does it for you, why reinvent the wheel? So Document AI is there for you. If you're not using Document AI, you might want to use some of the other machine learning APIs that Google Cloud provides. But do I want to write it from scratch for the fun of it, just because I can? No, it's going to take me years to write it if I'm working alone. If I have a team, I'll still ask for at least 12 months for that.
Cool. So yeah, just before we move on to the question side, I just want to give a bit of update from the MLOps point of view. So Google has released new innovations in terms of MLOps. So just a brief background, MLOps is an end-to-end lifecycle. So just like how DevOps is used to manage life cycles of software development, MLOps manages your model deployment. So everywhere from conceptuals to production, MLOps uses a pipeline to manage how your model is built, the feedback loop, everything. So most of the time you can use Kubeflow or something like Minikubes to deploy your workflows. But what Google has released is that now they're going to allow fully managed MLOps on the Google Cloud Platform. So instead of managing the pipeline, spinning up the servers yourself, you'll have a fully managed service available to you from Google. And fully managed means that you don't have to worry about the hardware, the firewall, the networking world, etc. Now, another thing that I want to talk about is now Google has released something called Google AI on-prem. So all these AI tools that's available online, Google is wanting it to bring it down to people who want to have that same capability on-prem. And this is really good news for us Africans because sometimes latency-specific problems from South Africa to, let's say, the closest data center in London takes 200 to 200, 180 to 200 milliseconds. And if I need latency lower than that, I need to have some sort of tools that I can use. And Google AI on-prem allows me to host my own AI models inside my own data center, which is pretty cool. Anything from your side, Robert, before we jump onto the questions?
No, I think we should go straight to the questions.
Cool.
Okay, great. Thank you so much. Now, onto the questions. The first question is from Bono Chinedu, and the question is, please, is Google Contact Center AI built on rule-based technique? Kimoon, Roberts.
Okay, so I can go. So if you look at the demonstration that we had up there, there were a bunch of things going on. You have the option of using voice or text to communicate. So what that means is there's the voice recognition side of things. That isn't rule-based. That's strictly neural networks. There's the speech-to-text side of things, which is to say you've said one thing, it's recognized it, but it needs to convert it to text before it extracts your intents from that. And then if it's responding to you, there's a text-to-speech component if it's responding via voice. There is the natural language understanding component, which is extracting entities and intents from your communication. All of these are rule-based. The rules come in when you ask a specific question that is cast in stone. So case in point would be, for instance, if an airline were to implement this, and then I say, what's your next flight to Johannesburg? And without knowing where I'm calling from, it might respond and say, where do you intend to fly from? And if I say I'm flying from Lagos, it will then tell me what the next flight is. So there will be a rule, typically an API endpoint to call to say, get all flights from Lagos to Johannesburg, and then tell me here's the next flight, or maybe even here are the next 3 flights, and maybe tell me how much they cost, whether or not I can book them in time, and all sorts of things. So again, do not look at contact center AI as one thing. It is typically a bunch of models doing different things, all blended together to make it seamless.
Yeah, if I can also jump in there, as Robert said, it's a combination of many tools. For example, contact center AI, before it was released, it was a feature on Dialogflow, so a chatbot agent, which uses natural language processing from Google's side, and then a combination of, let's say, Dialogflow, speech to text, Google Translation, all of these combine to produce essentially a Google Contact Center AI. So yeah, as Robert said, it's don't look at it as a single tool, but more of a multiple tool that seamlessly integrates together to create this experience.
Okay. So thank you, Kimoon and Robert. Chinedu says thank you. The next question is, can document AI handle different kinds of documents on the fly, or does it need to be trained on specific documents and the info it should extract from each?
So if I can answer that, so Document AI is an API call, so it can handle many different kinds of documents on the fly, meaning you can give it a document that is from one bank and another bank. It will detect where the boundaries are, so where the address is, who is it addressed to, etc. And then there's also something called AutoML. I don't know if it's released on Document AI yet, but essentially allows you to train your own document on top of Google's APIs. And that functionality will be released soon, or if not, it has been released. So yeah, you can train your own model using AutoML on top of Document AI, or you can just use Document AI as is.
Okay. Thank you. Robert, do you want to add anything on it?
No, nothing to add.
Okay, so there was a request. I think Kimoon, this is the time you were talking. If you could kindly speak more on biases.
Cool. So yeah, biases is very strange because you only encounter it. It's something like blinkers. If you can't see it, you won't see it. And biases is dictated by the data itself. So, for example, it might occur because of your data or due to human error or by the nature of the data itself. So a small little example is what you call it. Let's say I have data that's predicting rainfall. So because my model cannot accept Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday, Friday as words, I have to convert it to numbers. And what usually happens is I put many errors like that people do is they put Monday as 1, Tuesday as 2, Wednesday as 3. And you can see as your number increases, your weight of the number increases. And this will, and when you're training that data on neural nets or some sort of algorithms, that 5 for Friday is going to be much biased than Monday, which is 1. So these sort of errors can crop up unwillingly. And then there's several techniques that you do, such as one-hot encoding, etc. But usually if those things are not sort of caught early, it does influence the bias towards the end. That's the first sort of bias that one usually encounters. The second bias is towards something because of the data, nature of the data itself. So the example that I gave in terms of hiring employees, let's say if I took data from the 1920s or the 1930s of people voting, right, in the United States, and I use that data to predict how many people are going to vote in 2020. Now, for those who don't know history, women were not allowed to vote in the 1920s and the 1930s in the United States. I might be mistaken, but let's say it is. Now, because women data was not there, it's going to be more biased towards men if I use that data back then and try to implement it now. So those are the sort of biases that personally that one can unwillingly pick up when building your models. Robert, I don't know if you can add to that sort of sentiment.
Yeah, so bias is one of those complicated topics that at the beginning, looks like something simple, but in the end is, like one of those master's level or PhD level topics. So bias itself could be broken down into bias at the point of data collection, bias at the point of data analysis, and then bias at the point of model training. So again, you would even start by asking, how did you collect the data? Did you collect the data by sending foot soldiers out, or did you collect the data by publishing, let's say, a Google form and sending out a URL? So now, if you sent out a URL, what channel did you use to send out the URL? So suppose you sent out that URL via Twitter, then there's already a bias, which is that you only get responses from people who are on Twitter. But there's a greater bias, which is that you only get responses from people who are on the internet, right? So bias is something that you need to approach from a lot of angles. We're obviously out of time, but I think that at some point in the future, we will probably do an episode on bias in machine learning.
Okay. Thank you so much. I don't know if both of you have like 2 minutes to just answer this. It's not really a question, it's more like just something somebody posted. And the thing is that can AI understand humans fully at some point? So this is just what do you think? At some point, do you think that we'll be able to have AI understanding human beings fully? Before you give us your parting shots.
Okay, so I think I'll go first. Um, so depending on your school of thought, um, then you'll have different goals. So there's AI in general, but I come from the machine learning school of thought. The machine learning school of thought isn't trying to get AI to understand humans fully. Instead, it is trying to do only one thing, but to get it to both be right, but to also be able to generalize. And that is why you see that when we talk about these things, we try to explain that there are multiple models and not one model. And what you try to accomplish with multiple models is to have every individual model handle just one task, but it should be good at that task and it should be better than a human at performing that task. So if you look at AI from that perspective, then what you would be asking yourself is, are we going to get to the point where we have a model for everything and that model outperforms a human and then you start to interconnect those models? Maybe given enough time, we could get to that point. But is that really the quest? So the quest is just to say, train a model to do one thing, but to do it well.
So from my side, very quickly, what you call it, AI, a human is very complex, meaning it took us a million or hundreds of million years for us to get to this point. And from my side, I think we will eventually get to that point, because if you look at the computational power that we have, where AI was from, let's say, 5 years ago to what it is now, we increasing very quickly. So in July, the craze about GPT-3, right, where you put in any sort of questions and it gives you a response back as if it was a human. And people were saying that shouldn't have been possible within the next 5 or 6 years, but it happened. So for me, I think we'll approach there. How quickly, I do not know, but hopefully, yeah, AI will not be at a human level, but as John said, something that could supplement what we do.
Okay, so thank you so much, Kimoon and Robert. So there's one last question, and I don't know if you're going to have time to answer it, but it's how versatile is contact AI as regards to various industries who might need to use it, effectiveness and flexibility. I don't know if you want to answer it now, or maybe you can just answer it later on the chat section.
So maybe I can answer it very quickly. It's so industries are moving towards sort of streamlining, and as Robert has said, the banks, the contact centers, they use it. They use humans, and they are usually given a sort of paper to say, if it's this, you go move to that. If it's this sort of problem, you move to this sort of people. And once you need to automate those tasks, it becomes very effective and it's very scalable. But for specific problems that you don't have the answer to, or the human doesn't have answer, the AI doesn't have answer to, then yeah, it's pretty much what you call it. You consume, you use humans as opposed to agents. But if it's repetitive task, then it's very effective. Robert, maybe you can jump in as well.
I'll just go with your response.
Okay. So Finally, thank you so much to Kimoon and Robert for this amazing session. At least we have ended the season finale with a bang. It was really exciting to just have all of you and speaking about various things. I think everybody at the audience has learned a lot. The video is still going to be available for everybody who wants to watch it. So we will take two parting shots from Robert and Kimoon, and then we will end the broadcast. So Robert, parting shot from you.
Okay, so I'll say there's a whole lot to Google Cloud AI than what we had time to discuss in the past hour. So you should definitely go check it out. Check out the videos on YouTube from Google's channel. Check out the docs as well online. And all the best.
Okay, thank you, Robert.
Yeah, from my side is it's an exciting field, AI and the cloud, and I would advise everyone to go play around and learn from it. There's lots of free materials. There's machine learning crash courses. There's quick labs that you don't have to be an expert in it, but you can start learning and applying it to your everyday life. And I think taking that first step would be beneficial to everyone here.
Okay, so thank you so much to both of you. This has really been interesting. I am posting your Twitter links on the chat section if that's okay with you. So feel free to follow them on Twitter, feel free to follow them on LinkedIn and just chat them up. I'm sure they're open to answering some questions which we could not answer right now. Thank you so much, Robert. Thank you so much, Kimoon, and see you on the next season if we will be having one.
Bye.
Okay, so thank you everyone and goodbye. We ended the broadcast. Do feel free to reach out to them via the Twitter links I've posted on the chat section. If you want to reach out to them on LinkedIn, Kimoon is Kimoon Kim and Robert John. Yeah. Okay, bye everyone and see you on the next season.